Hi everybody, welcome back. In the last video we wrapped up right about here where in the last video we looked at all the different ways in which we can assess the value of environmental resources. We talked about these, the total economic value breaks down into use and non-use values, and then all of these subcategories here. So go back and check that one out if you haven't already. And then essentially we use economic evaluation techniques to figure out what is the benefit of environmental goods, particularly those which don't typically have prices or aren't exchanged in a normal market with buyers and sellers. So as we said, the cost of these sorts of things are relatively easy to calculate. Example, establishing a new national park. We can figure out how much that's going to cost based on the acreage, the land use types, the cost of labor for forest rangers, and so on and so forth, putting in roads. But the benefits, this is where economists come in. And at the very end of the last video, we talked about two high-level ideas about how we can figure out how much society values natural resources. We can ask them. That's called stated preference. Or we can examine their behavior. That's called revealed preference. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. In addition to those, we have a few here at the beginning: market valuation, cost of illness method, and replacement cost methods. I'll talk about those briefly. I'll also talk about stated preference sort of briefly, but really the revealed preference is kind of the direction most environmental economists go, and we'll discuss why as we go along. Let's start with market valuation. This is something we've already talked about. So in several videos ago, there's a video on economic well-being or welfare, and we measure that through consumer and producer surplus. So let me just give a little refresher quickly. There's a supply curve. There's a demand curve. Market equilibrium price. Equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium price. And what's above the price and below the demand curve is consumer surplus, that triangle there. And what's below the price, above the supply curve, out to the equilibrium quantity, that is producer surplus. And total surplus is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And that's going to be a value. That's going to be a monetary value. Remember, the demand curve is essentially what we can think of as people's willingness to pay, their value. And so there are some people who have a very high evaluation of goods, some down here who have a much lower evaluation of goods. And then the supply curve is made up of costs. But in this video and talking about the benefits, environmental benefits, we're really thinking about the demand curve. And like we discussed in the last video, the problem is that this is a market, but things like clean water, clean air, natural environmental resources, public goods, there is no market for a lot of these. And so what we have to do is try to estimate people's willingness to pay through various techniques. And ultimately, if we have market data, we use that and we just calculate consumer and producer surplus and we're done. That's sort of optimal, but when we can't do that, this is what we are seeking to replicate. So that's what we're going to be basing all the rest of these analyses on. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, Cost of illness method. So the example here is that if there are some environmental harm, this can be detrimental to human health. And the way that you could then measure the value of the environmental resource is if we can attribute negative health effects to the environment, we measure the costs of all those healthcare bills. So office visits, medication, other medical expenses, and that can be measured, and that can often be pretty well attributed to something happening in the environment. I believe, talk about an example here related to asthma. But there are also indirect costs. So economists are thinking always about additional costs, including opportunity costs. But if due to some environmental problems, people miss work or miss school, or have some pain and suffering, psychological effects, these are also, to the extent that they can be measured, and often they can, at least in indirect ways, we include these in that cost estimate. And so, as an example from the academic literature, a study estimated that the cost of asthma is $56 billion per year back in 2011, just due to the medical expenses, productivity, and death. So, because these are only the costs that can be easily measured, we often think of these as lower bounds. So basically, what that would mean is this is, what it really should say is at least 56 billion per year, because these are only the easily measured costs. And so if there was any policy being evaluated, then it should be at least $56 billion per year that we could use to help combat environmental problems that cause asthma, for example. Okay, so that's the cost of illness method. We also have replacement costs. So if you, for example, cut down a stand of trees in a forest, you could measure how long the cost of replacing that forest, including all the time that it would be needed for it to build back up. Also, water construction for water treatment. If we again lose the water purification benefits from a forest habitat, wetland restoration, bees do a great job pollinating. Theoretically, humans could pollinate everything, but that would be a very, very expensive thing to do. So what we could do to assess the value of bees existing is we could estimate how much it would cost for humans to go around and do all the pollinating. Very labor intensive. It would be just generally a very costly endeavor. And that would then therefore put a very high value on the existence of bees. Okay, so replacement cost. So those are the three first ones here: market valuation, cost of illness, and replacement cost. They do exist, and people do conduct these types of analyses, but the more common methods are these stated preference and revealed preference methods. So let's go ahead and let's do stated preference, and then we'll save revealed preference for its own video. Stated preference methods are based on survey responses to hypothetical scenarios. Survey responses to hypothetical scenarios. And the most common stated preference method is what's called contingent valuation. And contingent valuation is an economic tool that uses surveys to question people regarding their willingness to pay for a good. All right, contingent valuation, or CV for short, is an economic tool that uses surveys to question people regarding their willingness to pay for a good. Regarding their willingness to pay for a good. And yeah, so most of the time, and so far, we've talked about value as willingness to pay. Although sometimes there's this other, especially in surveys, this other concept called willingness to accept. So to give an example of the difference there, this first one is willingness to accept. The second one is willingness to pay. And so they seem equivalent. So what is the minimum amount of compensation you are willing to accept for a 10% decrease in air quality versus what is the maximum amount you are willing to pay for a 10% increase in air quality? And so these are essentially opposite sides of the same coin. But what often happens in willingness to pay versus willingness to accept is that the estimates for willingness to accept are much higher than willingness to pay. Even though sort of mathematically they're equivalent to each other, this comes down to adding a little bit of psychology into the mix, where there's this concept called loss aversion. And if you already have something, people generally assign more value to it than if you are assessing the value of paying for it without having it in the first place. So if I already have access to a national park and people are coming around and asking me, how much will I accept for this park to be demolished and turned into corporate offices, I would be giving a larger estimate of the value than if I live, somewhere I don't have a national park and somebody comes around and asks me, hey, we want to turn all of this land into a national park. How much are you willing to pay to do it? They seem very similar, but generally speaking, across multiple studies, willingness to pay estimates are less than willingness to accept. So as we're going to see with these other problems in surveys, it starts to become, with surveying, very psychological. And that's why economists are going to prefer the revealed preference techniques to the stated preference techniques, because if you ask people what they want or how much they value something, people can say anything. And that leads to these other problems. So you have the hypothetical bias. This is definitely a problem in surveys where you're asking people to consider something that doesn't exist and there's really no skin in the game. So if you're asking somebody, how much are you willing to pay for a national park, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to have to pay it. So I could say anything I wanted to. There's no way for them to kind of come back and make sure that in the end I pay what I said I was willing to pay. So the hypothetical bias is a problem. There are many other psychological problems. These are kind of heuristics about decision making, but one of them is anchoring. And so some of these contingent valuation surveys, which here's an example here, it asks, would you be willing to pay $75 in a tax for a wetlands protection program? If yes, then you ask them more. Will you pay $150? If they say no, then you ask, well, would you pay $40? But even if you have the same kind of sample of people, if you would have started with $150 and then you go up to maybe, I don't know, $240, or you go down to $75 if they say no, or up to $240 if they say yes, you'll have maybe not drastically, but you'll have different results based on where you start. Because wherever you start for something, that is the anchor. Some people actually talk about this for job salary negotiations, and it gets into all sorts of issues there. But some would say throw out the first number so that the conversation gets anchored to whatever is said first. So whatever is said first, it causes psychological responses that are going to affect the outcome. And then just a couple more here. So we have strategic bias. This is when a respondent intentionally provides an incorrect willingness to pay in order to advance a policy outcome. When a respondent intentionally provides an incorrect willingness to pay in order to advance a policy outcome. Okay, so if they come around and they ask me, how much am I willing to pay to protect the wetlands? Even if I might not even have the money, but I might just say absurdly high numbers because I really, really care a lot about the wetlands. And because, again, it's sort of a hypothetical situation, if I really care and if I do this, that means they're going to come in and they're going to tax me and my neighbors. They're almost surely not going to tax me this insanely high amount that I said. But if I have an incentive to provide a really high amount to affect the outcome of the survey. So there's this strategic bias when people are really passionate about some topic. And then one more, there are many others, but one more that I'll talk about is protest bids. And these are responses based on opposition to the question rather than the underlying valuation of the resource. Responses based on opposition to the question rather than the underlying valuation of the resource. Okay, and so here we're thinking about a couple examples. So it might be the case that you get a survey, somebody gets a survey, and it asks if they're willing to be having, well, actually this one here, a $75 tax annually to protect the wetlands. If you're asking somebody who's just generally opposed to taxes, they might say 0. Even though they might care about the wetlands, they might be opposed to the idea of being taxed. And so what you're getting there is an opposition to the taxes more so than an opposition to the actual resource. So you could get responses like that. And in general, we could ask, what does 0 mean? It could mean that I truly place 0 value on wetland protection. It could mean I just oppose taxes and I disagree with the question in the first place. It could also mean I am a super environmental activist. I love the wetlands tremendously, but I think that it is wrong or inappropriate to place a monetary value on it. Therefore, I put 0. So a 0 could mean a whole bunch of different things in a survey. And unless you do, some specific questioning and details within the survey to understand the demographics and kind of the thought processes of the people responding, then you could get some 0s in there that mean vastly different things. So in any case, you have these and other, let's just put other psychological, let's say, tricks or flaws that bias results. And these are many possibilities there. If you want to learn a little bit more about what those are, how do you spell that? Just a sec. Okay, Kahneman and Taversky. So these are a couple psychologists, and if you want to read more about that, these sort of psychological, ultimately, they have this extremely famous paper with which Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work. Taversky would have been included in that prize as well, except he died, and Nobel Prizes can't go to dead people. But they did work, I put it over here, back in 1974, called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. This paper essentially won them a Nobel Prize. And so if you want to look at how psychology affects human decision-making in ways that are not necessarily flaws, but when people make decisions under uncertainty, they're subject to these heuristics and biases. Kahneman has a really nice book related to this called Thinking Fast and Slow. There are other behavioral economists who do work related to this. One example would be Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely, to think of a couple. But essentially, all of this comes back to the idea that asking people what they think about things can often be flawed and biased. And so that's why, so this is all stated preference. We have some of these problems here. And some of these problems are going to be fixed using revealed preference methods. It's not, revealed preference is not a kind of an unflawed system. There are certainly pros and cons to each. But I would say mainstream economists generally favor these revealed preference techniques because it actually looks at how people behave. It actually looks at how people behave rather than what people say. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in the next video. And so thank you for watching this one, and I'll see you in the next one.